Today what we're doing is learning how to take photographs with blurry backgrounds. Now, why would we want to do this? If the item of interest in the photograph is perfectly in focus and the background is nicely out of focus, what happens is that item will stand out, and this is exactly what we would like to have when we photograph portraits. Okay, there's 5 ways in which we can create blurry backgrounds in our photographs. And we're going to look at each of those ways in detail. I'll just outline those now. The first way is the hardest one, which is to change the aperture on your camera to the lowest possible number. The second one is to make sure that the item that you're photographing is very close to the camera lens. The closer the item is to the camera lens in focus means the background will naturally fall out of focus. The third way is to make sure there's quite a lot of distance between what you're photographing and the background. Naturally, if you're focusing closer and there's a lot of distance, that background will blur quite nicely. The fourth way is to use a zoom lens. If we use a zoom lens, when you zoom in to the full amount of the lens, you isolate the subject quite nicely, and if they're far away from that background, it will beautifully fall out of focus. And the last way is to purchase a lens which has a very low aperture setting. Okay, we're going to have a look at that first point, which is change the aperture on our camera. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that aperture number that starts with an F is as low as possible. Now, what is aperture? Aperture is the opening inside your lens that lets in the light, and it opens and closes very similar to how your eye does. So how do we get our aperture nice and low on our camera? What you can do, if your camera has it, is put your camera into portrait mode. This will automatically select the lowest aperture, and the other settings will change to give you a correct exposure. If you don't want to put your camera into portrait mode, or your camera doesn't have a portrait mode, you can use what we call aperture priority. If you have a look at the dial on top of your camera, that will be A or AV, and that stands for aperture priority. So once you've put your camera into aperture priority mode, turn the dial and put your camera into its lowest aperture setting. The lower the aperture number, the blurrier the background. And you can see on my camera, I'm changing that down to f3.5. Now, as I zoom in and out on my camera, you'll notice that it changes all the way up to f5.6. Now, this isn't a problem, we'll just go with that. Sometimes as you zoom, the aperture will change on the lens that you have. The second point is to get what you're photographing as close as you can to the camera lens. Now, sometimes this might not work because it might not be practical. You also need to be aware that if you go through and you get very close to something with your camera lens and you're zoomed wide, what will happen is you'll get distortion, which means that the person's features might not be the most flattering. The third point is sort of self-explanatory, and that is to have the background as far away as possible from the subject that you're photographing. If you are using that low aperture setting and that background is far away, it will naturally fall out of focus and give you that blurry background. The fourth point is to use a zoom lens. Now, if you use a zoom lens with a good zoom and you zoom in as far as you can go, you might be quite a distance away from the subject that you're photographing, but if the background behind that subject is far away, you'll get a lovely background blur. You do need to remember to put your camera on that low aperture setting to get that background blur when you're using a zoom. And using a zoom also gives you a great side effect called compression. What compression does is it flattens the features of the subject that you're photographing, and it makes them look natural and very nice. Point number 5 is to get a low aperture lens. Now, if you buy a lens that has a very low aperture setting, you're going to get the best results. But this can get expensive very quickly. So what you might want to do is have a look at something called a nifty 50. This is a cheap 50mm lens that goes down to about f1.8 or maybe f1.7 depending on your manufacturer. Now this lens will give you a great background blur when you use that lower setting, and it won't cost you a lot of money. Okay, that's it from me. If you've got any questions, put them down in the comments below and I'll catch you next time.